Firstly, focusing on Hong Kong. Now, the headline results for Hong Kong is that, based on our survey, Hong Kong is the 9th most expensive city in Asia. Now, this actually represents a fall. So, relatively speaking, Hong Kong, compared to other cities in Asia, is actually becoming cheaper. So, for example, now Hong Kong is 9th, whereas in 2009 it was 5th, and 2010 it was 6th. So we're seeing Hong Kong consistently fall in our rankings in terms of the most expensive locations in Asia. And likewise, it's falling globally. Back in 2010, the location was ranked 32nd in the world, whereas now it's dropped 26 places and it's now ranked as the 58th most expensive city worldwide. And this is actually the largest drop of the 50 cities that we cover in Asia. So out of all of the 50 locations that we cover, Hong Kong has fallen most in the rankings. In fact, most locations in Asia have risen in our rankings, but Hong Kong is in the minority of locations which have actually fallen. And other locations which have also fallen in our rankings are locations like Bangkok, as well as locations in Vietnam. So Hong Kong joins these locations as cities which are falling in the rankings. Now, what's the cause of this fall? Well, we've seen that prices in Hong Kong have risen quite considerably in Hong Kong in the last 12 months. Based on our basket of goods and services, inflation has been 7%. So prices in Hong Kong in September 2011 are 7% higher than they were the same time last year. However, although prices in Hong Kong dollar terms have risen, compared to other locations, Hong Kong is becoming cheaper. That's because, for example, of the fact that Hong Kong is pegged to the US dollar. So because it's pegged against a weak currency, that's meant that other locations have overtaken it. An example is Singapore. Last year, Singapore was ranked below Hong Kong in our survey. It was ranked 9th. However, between 2010 and 2011, prices in Singapore increased at a rate of 5.7%. So this was a lower rate than Hong Kong. However, because the Singapore dollar has been very strong in the last 12 months, when we take those prices in Singapore dollar terms and then we convert them into Hong Kong dollars, that accelerates the rate of increase. So that's why Singapore has now overtaken Hong Kong. Although inflation is not as high as it is here in Hong Kong, when we convert those prices in Singapore dollars into Hong Kong dollars, it means that Singapore is now more expensive than the cost of living here in Hong Kong. And so we've seen that in other locations as well. Hong Kong, for example, has been overtaken by locations in Australia, where because of the strength of the Australian dollar, this means that prices in Australian dollars, when now converted into Hong Kong dollars, are higher than they were last year. Likewise, China. Last year again, both Beijing and Shanghai were cheaper than Hong Kong. However, the reason why both Beijing and Shanghai are now more expensive in our rankings, why they're higher in our rankings, is a product of two things. Firstly, prices have increased at a faster rate in China. So while prices in Hong Kong have only increased by 7%, measured by our basket of goods, prices in mainland Chinese cities have increased by 9%. So prices are rising at a faster rate. And also, in China, everything is priced in renminbi, which has strengthened against the Hong Kong dollar. So when we take those prices, which are 9% higher, and then convert them from renminbi into Hong Kong dollars, that again accentuates it, exaggerates the rate of increase, and that's why Beijing and Shanghai have now overtaken Hong Kong in our rankings. Remain competitive. I mean, if you look at most studies of competitiveness, Hong Kong often outpaces most other locations in Asia, with the exception of Singapore. So Hong Kong's main, I suppose, competitor, the main country or location that it competes with is Singapore. Now, one of the good things about this survey is that it shows that now it costs less to bring people into Hong Kong in comparison to Singapore. The size of the cost of living allowance that companies have to pay is lower than it is in Singapore. So that adds to Hong Kong's relative competitiveness in comparison to Singapore. It doesn't necessarily affect their competitiveness, but what it does affect is it affects the cost of them sending staff overseas. So that means that, again, if you're sending staff to places like Singapore now, China, particularly Beijing and Shanghai, you now have to provide cost of living allowances. So that adds on to your wage bill that you have to pay to your international assignees. So yes, that will have an impact on their salary base. Whether or not it will have an impact on their competitiveness, I doubt it. But it will definitely have an impact on the cost of Hong Kong companies establishing or expanding themselves overseas. Firstly, the reason why housing is not taken into account in the basket is because normally for multinational companies, when they move staff around the world, housing is provided as a separate benefit in kind. The company doesn't provide the employee with a cash allowance for housing, they'll provide it as a benefit in kind. And because this is taken care of elsewhere in employees' compensation, we don't include it in our basket of goods. The basket of goods that we use to measure here is simply designed to provide the employee with an allowance to help maintain their day-to-day living pattern. If we took housing into consideration, this would probably push Hong Kong up to the second most expensive location in Asia, behind Tokyo. But on a day-to-day basis, it still remains in 9th position. What we have seen within China is the most expensive city is now Beijing. In mainland China, last year, the most expensive city was Shanghai. But Beijing has now overtaken Shanghai and is now the most expensive city in China. It's also the 7th most expensive location in Asia. The 8th most expensive is Shanghai, and then obviously the 9th most expensive is Hong Kong. And Beijing is the 35th most expensive city worldwide. On the other hand, out of the approximately 20 cities that we cover in China, Xi'an is the cheapest Chinese city. This is the 28th most expensive city in Asia and the 155th most expensive city worldwide. And what we've seen over the course of the past 12 months is that many of these Chinese second-tier cities, provincial cities, like Xi'an, other examples would be Chengdu, as well as Tianjin, Shenyang, etc. They've increased significantly in our rankings, and that's the product both of high rates of inflation in China and also the strength of the renminbi in comparison to other global currencies.